Hi, everybody. Welcome to CMN 201, and this is for our class for Wednesday, the 18th, where we are talking about the Blair Witch Project. I also wanted to introduce 28 Days Later and also just give you a sense of where we are in the semester because next week we will not be having class because of Thanksgiving holiday. And what I have found is that right after Thanksgiving, things move very, very quickly. So I believe last class I had asked you to contact me about your final project and what some of your thinking was for that. So if you haven't already done so, please do that so that I can give you my feedback. Today also I thought I'd talk a little bit about quotation in the event that that would be useful for you in formulating and writing your final project. But first, I thought I'd start with the Blair Witch Project, which was a phenomenon in the 1990s. And that was one of my attendance questions was, how do you think it illustrated the 90s? Um, it definitely started the found footage movement. So if you think about all of the films that have followed, a movie about a movie, a very meta and self-reflective that is, and definitely it was a mockumentary, or you can think of it as a faux documentary. And it was method acting for the actors. Basically, they were put into the wilderness and they were deprived of food, not necessarily water, and they had to endure very harsh conditions. And they ad-libbed many of their lines to try to get a sense of authenticity and to get a sense of realism, which I think is very similar or is very successful in this film. And it's also very similar in terms of the formula to the slasher films, things like Halloween that we've talked about before, where you isolate your characters and you eliminate them by a dehumanizing force. The shaky camera, and I think I indicated that I find this particular film to be somewhat difficult to watch because I tend to suffer from motion sickness. And that was exactly the physical reaction the filmmakers wanted from the viewer. They wanted the viewers to feel discomfort in the way that the characters were feeling discomfort. And honestly, the actors were feeling discomfort. So that is one of the reasons perhaps why the Blair Witch Project made media headlines, but probably the bigger reason was because it was an independent movie on a shoestring budget, $60,000. A group of filmmaker friends got together and they put together all of their credit cards, took out cash um, advances and it got $60,000 together and put together a film. Now, I do not recommend that you necessarily do that in relation to your own filmmaking, but they've made over $250 million. So, at least for them, it was definitely a gamble that was worth it. In relation to my attendance question, well, certainly you can talk about lots of things. If you could talk about fashion and you can talk about music and you can talk about lighting or the found footage movement. Really, what I was thinking about in relation to the 90s in this film is the birth of the internet. And the marketing campaign for this film was nothing short of genius, where they put together an internet website so that they could build this buzz about the film. And individuals who read the website, it was put together in such a realistic way that they weren't necessarily sure whether or not what they were reading was true or not true. And of course, that's one of the greatest strengths of this particular film is that it plays with this idea of what is reality. And they did the same with their own marketing campaign. And you can even still go on there, www.blairwitch.com. You can see I've put that in our notes, where you can see newsreel footage and interviews of 3 rural filmmakers shooting a film based on an urban legend. And there was a documentary that was aired on the Sci-Fi Channel in 1999 entitled The Curse of the Blair Witch, which basically gave all of the folklore of the Blair Witch. So audiences were already, many of them, believing that there was a Blair Witch and that there were indeed 3 filmmakers. The Internet Movie Database for the film went one step further and listed the actors as deceased. So again, it was a very clever technique to try to play with this idea of realism, of faux realism, in order to engage audience. This question of what is reality, and movies obviously try to mimic reality, but they are not reality. And we know that the characters in this particular film are unsure of what their own reality is with what they are experiencing. This is a very subtle film. The horror is more about what you don't see than what you see. Many of the situations they encounter can be easily explained away as being meaningless, or they could be explained as having some sort of occult significance. By the way, the word occult means unknown, or it's one of the meanings of unknown, which is what basically this film is grappling with. What is reality? What is known? What is unknown? And if you think about how technology, cameras in this particular film, but also internet sites in terms of the marketing of this film, and fast forward to 2020 when we live in a world of social media and this need to document something or else it hasn't happened. I've never quite understood why people take pictures of their meals and feel the need to post those on social media, but they do. And also this concern that we have about fake news and what is exactly the real story and how much bias is there in the way that technology presents. Technology is supposed to be objective, but as you know, technology can be manipulated so that it is subjective. And certainly the individuals who use technology are guilty of subjectivity. So all of those layers of what is reality, particularly in the late 1990s, a time of particular stress as we began thinking about, and I remember the new millennium and what that might mean. So when you get to the ending of the millennium and the beginning of a new millennium, there usually is a certain level of anxiety. There definitely was anxiety in the late 1990s from something called Y2K. There was a concern in terms of the programming of the computers that had been done in the last 50 years or so, that when they programmed them, they hadn't anticipated going to the year 2000, so there wasn't code that would go to 2. There was just code for the 1900s, a 1 rather than a 2, and that wasn't put in any binary code because computers work through ones and zeros. And the question is, would the computers be able to read the change as we move to 2000, or would they all be frozen? And if they were indeed frozen, what would that mean for civilization? And could that be the ending of our civilization as we knew it? Luckily for us, everything was fine and there wasn't any problem with moving forward into the 2000s, at least from a computer perspective. But the line where Josh is speaking with Heather, I think, is particularly telling. And of course, she has this need to document everything. If this film doesn't anticipate social media, I don't know what does. And Josh says to Heather, "I see why you like this video camera so much. It's not quite reality. No, it's totally like a filtered reality, man. It's like you can pretend everything's not quite the way it is." And of course, if you wanted to fast forward to now 2020, we're less likely to be using a video camera. We're more likely to be using a cell phone. But the same sort of idea. We also see all of the misunderstandings and the solitude that's brought on by technology, this filtered reality. As Heather says, it's the only thing she has left. It's the only thing that she can grasp onto as they continue to bicker amongst themselves. And this question of sanity and insanity, are they sane? Why would they engage in this project in the first place if they were sane? And more importantly, does their sanity begin to disintegrate as their fear begins to exponentially grow? I mean, at one point, we have a character admit that he threw away the map. Not that the map was proving to be particularly useful, but that does seem to be a rather insane action at that particular point. The film is very subtle and ambiguous and suggestive, as I had said earlier. The fear is what we don't see in the unknown and the darkness. I know there's been a lot of questions about the ending of the film and what is the meaning and what happened. I think that's a lot less interesting than the descent of the characters into fear. And another point that I think is quite interesting about this film is this contrast between wilderness and civilization. So much so that at one point, one of the characters says something to the effect that it's impossible to get lost in the United States. And guess what? It is quite possible. There is quite a bit of the United States that still is not mapped and still has not been civilized, if you will. And that leads to the possibility of all kinds of unknown monstrosity in that uncivilized land. An interesting question that I was reading about the Blair Witch, but I think it could be applicable to just about all of the Gothic films that we've been reading. Does the victim empower the monstrosity by actually seeking it out? And I think that that's something that we can see with many of the films that we've watched thus far. Obviously, some of the monsters have to be sought out so that they can be killed. But does that give the monstrosity a certain level of power? And does that give the monstrosity a certain level of agency, particularly if that monstrosity is within ourselves? So I leave you with that, and I wanted to transition over to quoting and documentation so that if you are working on your final project, and I hope by this point you've made some decisions about what you are going to be writing your final project about, or if you are going to be doing something a little bit different, as I said, you've got creative options as well. So if you wanted to do something like write a screenplay or something of that nature, you certainly have the option. But again, do touch base with me via my email about your thoughts. All of the humanities, and this includes this particular class, CMN Communications, uses the MLA, which stands for Modern Language Association, System for Parenthetical Documentation. And that's just a fancy way of saying that we use parentheses at the ending of quotes to document or indicate where we got that quote from. Now, English 101 was a prerequisite for this class, so I am hopeful that you've already heard of the MLA, which would have been discussed in English classes. And that said, I know that I don't want to necessarily assume anything, so I've just very briefly put some major points about the MLA in our notes below and a couple of websites that could be of use to you. Basically, at the ending of a quotation, we open up a parentheses, and within that parentheses, we most likely will include a page number, and just the number. We don't have to write P or PG or whatever the case may be. Close parentheses, and then we have our ending punctuation, or we continue on with our sentence. So punctuation goes after the documentation. If the sentence continues, I gave you an example of that as well. So here are two sentences. The first where punctuation is after documentation. Quote, Krebs went to the war from a Methodist college, unquote, open parentheses, 162, close parentheses, period. So that means on page 162, you could find that quote. If the sentence were to continue, and here's the quote, although, quote, Krebs went to the war from a Methodist college, unquote, open parentheses, 162, close parentheses, he cannot pray with his mother, period. So that said, obviously there's a lot of information that is not included within those parentheses that the reader is going to need to know in order to be able to verify that that quote is correct, which is the reason why we document or we give information to the reader where they can find that quote. Because it doesn't help you if I say 162 if you don't know what book it's from. And this is how the MLA system works, that you do give all of that information, but you list it only once at the end in something called the Works Cited page. And that's a page where you list all of the books and the magazine articles and the websites and whatever the case may be that you've quoted from over the course of your paper. And then in the actual paper itself, if it's clear based on the way you've constructed your sentences where you are getting that quote from, then the page number would suffice. If it's not clear, then you may need to add additional information, such as the author's surname and, let's say, the page number. And if you have multiple texts from the same author, then the surname wouldn't be enough. Then you'd have to actually add part of the title. And then what a reader does as they're reading a paper is that once they see that information in the parentheses, they go to the ending of the paper, to the Works Cited page, and they can look up the applicable author and text and find all of the necessary information, such as the place of publication, the publisher, and so forth. And there are particular rules on how to format and document all of this. And two websites that I highly, highly recommend. The first is Purdue OWL. And this is a website from Purdue University. And you can see that I've included the link under the section for quoting and documentation, where they go through the entire writing process from brainstorming to actually handing in a final copy. So it's a great site. And they do review the MLA and how to document and how to format. But there also is the GCC library, and the library is well aware that you are probably writing papers over the course of your career. So they've put together writing and citation guides as well. So, for your purposes, you may or may not be using outside sources, depending on how you proceed. So, if you're just doing your own analysis of a particular film and you aren't necessarily using any outside resources, once you've identified that film and the director in the opening paragraph, and if your quotation was merely from the film itself, that would suffice. You wouldn't necessarily need to have a works cited page. However, once you start pulling in outside resources from other areas, so for instance, once you've started using books or magazine articles or multiple films, and then in that case, then you could use a works cited page. When in doubt, always better to just include one than not include one. But again, that'll be up to your discretion on how it is you go about putting together your paper, what resources you use. You can see that I've also included 2 other elements that might be of use to you in relation to quotation. If you wanted to insert your own language in a quote, the convention for that is using square brackets, not parentheses, square brackets. And there's an example of that in the section on quoting and documentation. Quote, even his, and then a square bracket, Krebs, and then a closing square bracket, lies were not sensational, unquote, and then we have parentheses 162 close parentheses. So basically what's in the square bracket is your language. So that's your clue to the reader that whatever's in the square bracket was not in the original quotation. That was your insertion. And you do that when you want to clarify something, not when you want to analyze something. But you can see in the example that I gave you, we've got a pronoun of his, and that could be unclear who the his is referring to because there are multiple male characters in that text. So in the square brackets, I indicated the character's name to clarify who the his was. So that's usually the way we use that square bracket, and it's not used frequently. Think of it almost like interrupting somebody when they're speaking. You try to avoid doing it unless it's absolutely necessary. And you can also omit something from a quote. And the idea behind that is based on where you've decided to begin your quote from and where you've decided to end your quote. Between those 2 points, you might want to omit something and delete it. And obviously there was lots of information before you started your quote that you elected not to quote from. And obviously there will be lots of information after your quote that you've elected not to quote as well. So it's between your start and end point from where you've decided to have your quote. If you decide to leave out something or omit it, then what you use is something called an ellipsis, and it's fondly known as the 3 periods or the 3 dots, dot, dot, dot. And you can see that I've given an example of that also. Krebs, comma, quote, during this time, dot, 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 was sleeping late in bed, unquote, and then in parentheses 162. So where those 3 dots are in succession, basically that's my way of telling you, the reader, that I've omitted or deleted a word or several words because they just aren't relevant or applicable. I'm not deleting or omitting words to change the meaning or to in any way deceive. That would be unethical. I'm leaving out something that just would not necessarily be needed for your understanding of the text. So that's a very quick review about the MLA. And our next class, as I indicated, is Thanksgiving recess. So there is no class. But what you would want to do is watch before that 28 days later. And luckily, I was able to find a free link online. So you can see that that's included in our notes below. And it was a text I wasn't too sure, or a film I wasn't too sure about. But in part because it has some contemporary relevance to our own virus and our own challenges today. But it seems that the consensus is more than the consensus. It's unanimous from those of you who've contacted me that this film is incredibly timely and relevant and should be seen. So I also know that you may or may not have had an opportunity to register for classes for next semester. And as I indicated, after Thanksgiving, things move fast. So in the notes below, I've included a link for you for registration so that you can see the classes that are being offered for the intersession as well as for the spring. And you can contact your advisor if your advisor hasn't already contacted you so that you can register for your classes. In relation to 28 Days Later, Projected Fears talked about how they thought that film would achieve a cultural status and it hasn't. Now, I'm quite curious, considering the parallels with our current situation, if this film might indeed still achieve cult status. It's oftentimes read as an updated zombie tale, but George Romero, and you'll remember him from Night of the Living Dead, the creator of the zombie, maintained quite vehemently that this was anything but a zombie tale. And that while it was an interesting film, it had absolutely nothing to do with his conception of the zombie. Others have talked about it's just an updated zombie because what we have now is a fast zombie. The difference is that these individuals aren't dead, they're infected with virus, specifically rage virus, which is one of the more interesting metaphors in the film. The film is British, and thus far we've been focusing mostly on American films, though we talked a little bit about German Expressionism when we talked about The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. So I thought it would be interesting to see film from a different culture. And also, it I think is very much representative of the early 2000s. Now, this film was made before 9/11, but it basically was released just shortly prior and or shortly after, and it was very haunting to the viewers who saw this particular film because it seemed to have a good number of parallels to what happened in 9/11 and the sense of an apocalyptic society, which Romero in Night of the Living Dead began playing with, but definitely we see in a much more visceral way with something like 28 Days Later. And again, perhaps some modern day parallels in our own lived experience. Amongst some of the critiques of this film, similar to George Romero, is that you'll have a critique of media. And of course, that's basically what the Blair Witch Project was doing, ironically, while also using media and film and camera to critique media, film, and camera. Very meta. The critique of media, the critique of government, the critique of consumerism. You will see scenes in there that are perhaps somewhat reminiscent of Night of the Living Dead, or if you're a George Romero fan, some of the other Romero zombie movies. And we will also see the importance of community. And I thought that considering what is happening in our current society, that could be the impetus for today's attendance question after you've watched 28 Days Later, and that would be due on Thursday the 19th at 6 p.m. What do you think our current society in 2020 should learn from the film 28 Days Later? What do you think our current society in 2020 should learn from the film 28 Days Later? So I hope you're well. I'm well. I did want to give a little bit of a trigger alert. There are some disturbing scenes in this film, as one would expect in horror film, and there also is an attempted rape that isn't successful. But I just wanted to warn you of that. So again, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and I'm curious to hear what you have to say about 28 Days Later. Take care. Bye bye.